Imagine being so brilliant at warfare that the enemy high command goes from calling you incompetent to absolutely dreading the sight of your name on intelligence reports. Picture defeating not one, but two of the most feared military machines in history, using tactics so innovative that military academies still study them today. And doing all of this, whilst knowing that one mistake, one failure, could mean a bullet from your own side. That's the extraordinary story of the man who saved the Soviet Union from total annihilation. And trust me, you've probably never heard his name before. But by the end of this, you will all understand why he might just be the most brilliant military mind of the entire Second World War. Let's set the scene properly. It's 1939, and most people's attention is on Europe, where Germany is about to kick off the deadliest conflict in human history. But thousands of miles away, on the dusty plains between Mongolia and Japanese-controlled Manchuria, another war is brewing, and it's here, in a place most Europeans couldn't find on a map, that our story begins. The Japanese Empire and the Soviet Union had been having border disputes for months. The Japanese reckoned the border between their puppet state of Manchukuo and Mongolia sat right on the Khalkhin River. The Soviets and Mongolians disagreed, insisting the actual border was about 16 kilometers further east. Now, that might not sound like much, but in geopolitics 16 kilometers can be worth fighting over. Border patrols from both sides were clashing regularly, and by the summer of 1939, things were getting properly heated. Enter Georgy Zhukov. On the 1st of June, he was summoned to Moscow. Now, you have to understand what that meant in Stalin's Soviet Union. The military purges were in full swing. Officers were being arrested and executed left and right, often based on nothing more than paranoid suspicion. When Zhukov got that summons, he genuinely thought he was about to become another victim. He probably spent that entire journey to Moscow wondering if he'd ever see his family again. But instead of the NKVD's interrogation rooms, Zhukov found himself given command of the 1st Army Group at Khalkhin. His mission was straightforward: stop the Japanese aggression once and for all. 4 days later, on the 5th of June, he arrived at the front and immediately began surveying the terrain. What he saw was a military planner's nightmare and, if you were clever enough, a tactical dream. The landscape was utterly flat, treeless, empty steppe as far as the eye could see. Traditional defensive positions would be impossible, but Zhukov's mind worked differently than most. Where others saw vulnerability, he saw opportunity. He started bringing in motorized brigades, aircraft, and most importantly, fast-moving BT tanks. These were perfect for the terrain, light enough to move quickly across the hard ground but still packing a serious punch. But here's where Zhukov started showing his genius. He believed that in an environment like this, tanks shouldn't just waddle along supporting infantry like they'd always done. Instead, they should operate as independent strike forces, moving fast and hitting hard without being slowed down by foot soldiers. This was a radical departure from Soviet doctrine at the time, and the Japanese had absolutely no idea what was coming. Throughout July, the front settled into a stalemate after several smaller battles, but Zhukov was just getting started. He planned his major offensive for the 20th of August, and in the days leading up to it, he pulled off one of the cleverest deceptions of the entire pre-war period. Under cover of darkness, he gradually moved his units into attack positions. But here's the brilliant bit. He had the mufflers removed from his supply trucks and drove them constantly in front of his tanks at night. The roar of those truck engines completely masked the sound of the tank engines. Night after night, the Japanese side of the steppe thundered with engine noise. Japanese patrols were going absolutely mental, trying to figure out how many troops and vehicles the Soviets were bringing up, and more importantly, what kind of forces they were facing. They knew something big was coming, but they had no idea what. Then, on the morning of the 20th of August, 1939, the Mongolian steppe exploded. Soviet artillery opened up with a bombardment that would have made the Western Front jealous. Following that, over 550 aircraft swept across the Japanese positions. This was actually the very first fighter-bomber offensive in Soviet Air Force history, and the Japanese were completely unprepared for it. Their front lines were absolutely pulverized. Shortly after the bombardment lifted, over 50,000 Soviet and Mongolian troops stormed the Japanese center. The Yubanes, realizing they were facing a massive frontal assault, pulled units from their flanks to reinforce the center. It was the natural, sensible thing to do. It was also exactly what Zhukov wanted them to do. Because whilst the Japanese were focused on that brutal fight in the center, two massive armored wings, The 4th, 6th, and 11th Tank Brigades swept wide around both Japanese flanks. They drove deep behind enemy lines at lightning speed, overrunning supply roads, cutting communication lines, and blocking escape routes. By the 25th of August, those two Soviet wings linked up near the entire Japanese 23rd Division, the elite corps of their 6th Army in the region, was completely surrounded on the open steppe with nowhere to run. The Japanese tried desperately to break out, but Soviet fortifications destroyed every attempt. The surrounded forces, refusing to surrender, were systematically annihilated by Soviet aircraft and artillery. Zhukov had achieved exactly what he planned: a perfect encirclement and the total destruction of an entire Japanese division. Japan never again risked a northern war with the Soviet Union. From that point on, they turned their ambitions toward the Pacific instead. Zhukov's innovative use of armored spearheads and his extraordinary ability to handle logistics earned him serious recognition from Soviet high command. That recognition would soon place him at the center of the greatest war in human history. By autumn 1941, the Soviet Union was on the brink of total collapse. Operation Barbarossa had been devastating. In just 4 months, the Germans had torn through thousands of kilometers of Soviet territory, destroyed entire armies, and killed or captured millions. Now they were turning toward Moscow itself. On the 2nd of October, the Wehrmacht launched Operation Typhoon, an offensive aimed at the Soviet capital with nearly 1 million men and 1,700 tanks. German spearheads smashed through Soviet defenses at Bryansk and Vyazma, encircling over 500,000 Soviet troops. It was one of the worst disasters of the war for the Soviets, leaving Moscow virtually defenseless. German propaganda was claiming the Soviet collapse was imminent and that German soldiers would be home by Christmas. On the 10th of October, Zhukov was urgently flown in from the Leningrad defense and given one simple task: hold Moscow at all costs. The situation was absolutely critical, but Zhukov acted immediately. One of his first moves was converting Moscow's factories to produce war materials. Clock factories started producing mines. Chocolate factories made tinned food. Automobile factories became tank repair shops. Women and teenagers were put to work building anti-tank ditches, moving nearly 3 million cubic meters of earth with no mechanical equipment whatsoever. He assembled new divisions from scratch and ordered all available forces to strengthen the Mazesk defensive line. Throughout October, the Soviets continued losing ground, but the mounting German casualties from these new defenses forced them to slow their offensive by the end of the month. This gave Zhukov time to reorganize before winter properly set in. Then he got news from Soviet espionage that would change everything. Japan wouldn't attack the USSR in the east. That meant the battle-hardened Siberian and Far Eastern divisions could be brought west. These men were tough as nails and accustomed to fighting in temperatures that froze German engines solid. Zhukov placed them at critical sectors along the front and waited for the German attack he knew was coming. On the 15th of November, the Wehrmacht launched what they hoped would be their knockout blow. It was a pincer attack meant to encircle Moscow, with forces linking up near Klin. The northern German tank armies made good progress, but in the south, fresh Soviet reinforcements violently stopped the German pincer in its tracks. Zhukov later wrote that the enemy was making frontal assaults regardless of casualties, willing to get to Moscow by any means necessary. When you consider that the Germans had a severe lack of winter clothing and reported over 100,000 cases of frostbite, you get a picture of just how desperate they were to find shelter in Moscow before the full Russian winter hit. One German general reported temperatures of -45°C on the 30th of November. Despite their efforts, Zhukov's brilliant multi-layered defense reduced Soviet losses whilst inflicting tremendous casualties on the advancing Germans. Still, the Wehrmacht pressed on, but as the southern pincer slowly approached Kashira, Zhukov organized a vicious counterattack with fresh forces equipped with new semi-automatic rifles and factory-new tanks. The fighting was brutal, but Guderian's armored spearhead was, for the first time in the war, pushed back over 40 kilometers. The German pincer was finally halted. After this brilliant defensive operation, Zhukov launched the first major Soviet counteroffensive of the war on the 5th of December. Over 1 million Soviet troops and 1,700 tanks surged forward along a 1,000-kilometer front, with Siberiansky troops sweeping around German flanks. By early January, the Wehrmacht had been forced up to 250 kilometers away from Moscow. The capital was saved. The German dream of capturing Moscow and ending the war by Christmas was over. Zhukov had proved his mastery of logistics, defensive layering, and the rare ability to read enemy intentions. He was celebrated as a hero across the Soviet Union. But the German war machine was far from defeated. After failing to take Moscow, the Wehrmacht turned toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, the lifeblood of any modern military. The city guarding the Volga River and anchoring the northern flank of this push was Zhukov understood immediately how important it was, noting that if Stalingrad fell, the enemy could cut off the south of the country from the center. In August, the Luftwaffe started dropping up to 1,000 tons of bombs on the city every single day, turning it into smoldering ruins. German mechanized infantry divisions advanced through the wreckage, taking 90% of the city by September. But that remaining 10%, the industrial districts, was nearly impossible for German tanks to navigate after all the bombing. It all had to be taken by infantry. The fighting became absolute hell. Stalin's infamous order, "Not one step back," meant virtually every building became a battleground. German commanders described combat in the factories as fighting inside a furnace, where snipers and grenades took thousands of lives daily. One letter found on a dead German officer captured the horror perfectly, describing how the whole campaign in France was shorter than the fight for one factory building, and questioning when the hell would end. But what the Germans didn't know was that Zhukov was keeping them focused on the city deliberately, supplying just enough men and equipment to keep the battle going whilst preparing something much bigger outside. Drawing on his experience from Khalkhin Gol in 1939, Zhukov wasn't just planning to defend Stalingrad, he was planning to completely destroy the German force inside it. He understood that the German 6th Army was severely overextended, with virtually their entire force pushed deep into Stalingrad. That meant their flanks were UNT held by elite German units, but by poorly equipped Romanians with virtually no anti-tank weapons. When confronting Soviet armored spearheads on the open steppe, this could only spell disaster. Just like the Japanese at Khalkhin Gol, the Germans had severely underestimated Zhukov's ability to move and build up incredible amounts of armored units over months whilst keeping them hidden from Luftwaffe reconnaissance. By mid-November, Zhukov had quietly assembled 5 complete Soviet armies and launched his attack on the 19th of November. The northern and southern spearheads raced forward. The effect was immediate and devastating. Within hours, Soviet armor had smashed through the defenders, opening enormous gaps everywhere. Before German commanders inside Stalingrad could comprehend what was happening, their flanks had vanished. On the 23rd of November, just 4 days after the offensive began, the 2 Soviet encircling forces met at Calais, completing one of the most famous encirclements in military history. The entire German 6th Army, over 250,000 of Germany's best men, along with thousands of vehicles and equipment, was trapped inside a shrinking pocket. Throughout December, Soviet artillery pulverized them from all sides. The 6th Army was ground down until the last survivors finally surrendered on the 2nd of February. Once again, Zhukov had executed both the planning and the operation without error, delivering the most crushing German defeat up to that point. The Wehrmacht would be forced onto the defensive for the rest of the war. So what made Zhukov so special? It wasn't just tactical brilliance, though he had that in spades. It was his ability to innovate, to see opportunities where others saw only problems, to handle logistics on a scale most commanders couldn't even comprehend, and to read his enemy's intentions with frightening accuracy. From the steppes of Mongolia to the streets of Stalingrad, he consistently outhought and outfought some of the most vaunted military forces in history. If you enjoyed learning about one of history's most brilliant yet underappreciated military minds, hit that like button.